Shalom Alechem, Erev Tov, good evening from Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh. I'm on this side of the fast, and I can tell you this much, and that is that the Beit HaMikdash, we didn't rebuild it yet today, so far, at least on this side of the world. But B'ezrat Hashem, by the time you guys make it here, I'm sure that we'll have some more hands on deck, and we'll be able to pull that off. For right now, I ask that for those of you who can have your cameras on, it's always conducive to the limud to be able to see you. For those of you who can't, I understand that it's the middle of the day. For many people, you might be at work, you might be resting from the fast, whatever it might be. And so we completely understand it as well. Rabbi Yosef will be presenting a shiur for us tonight. I'm going to talk about him in just a moment. But just a general, like every other class we have in Shiviti, you're more than welcome, I'm sure, to stop and ask questions. But in order so that Rabbi Yosef can get through the material that he has, I recommend the following, and that is that unless it's something that you possibly cannot understand without unmuting yourself, wait for the question until the end. And I'm sure that when we're done the shiur, Rabbi Yosef is more than happy to stick around for a few minutes and answer questions that come up in light of the shiur. For those who have not yet had the chance to learn Torah with Rabbi Yosef is a very dear friend of mine. And not just a friend, he's the rabbi of Kahal Kadosh Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia. Some of you have been there before. It's a Spanish and Portuguese, but the synagogue of the American Revolution, from the oldest Kehillat that we have still functioning in the United States of America, if not the oldest. Rabbi Yosef, you'll correct me, but it's still functioning.
Oldest continuous.
Oldest continuous, Baruch Hashem. And aside from that, Rabbi Yosef has definitely done many other wonderful things in the world. Aside from sitting in our Bet Din, Shiviti, there are people in this room who have been welcomed into Am Yisrael by him, and it's a big zechut for us to have him here. Usually we get to have him in person, but this Tisha B'Av, we are not together, yet we are together on Zoom. So for those asking for an update on Mori Harav Yaakov Peretz, I'll send out a video later. For right now, I want to focus on Limud Torah. We're going to be discussing national versus personal mourning in Jewish tradition. And as you know, in previous shurim of Rabbi Yosef, that this is going to be a treat for sure. So forgive me if my video will go off or my audio will go off, but I'm going to hand over the shiur to Rabbi Yosef, and he'll be the official host of tonight's shiur. Rabbi Yosef, anything else before we start?
Are we going to have the source sheet screen shared by you or by me?
You want to share the source sheet screen?
Unless everyone has access to it already.
Does everyone have I sent out the link. Everyone has the link to the source sheet? Okay, is anyone here? I think it's better if you just talk. That way they see you and they can look the source sheet.
I prefer that. If everyone has the source sheet, then let's just move forward.
Perfect. I'm going to spotlight you like that.
Oh, very okay. Thank you, Doron. Thank you. You just shared it.
Yeah, and if there's new people who come in, you can keep posting that link. That would be very helpful.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Rabbi Yonatan. The zechut really is mine. The pleasure is mine. It's been a little too long since the last class that we had on Tisha B'Av with Shiviti, and last time we met, I think I spoke about the resurgence of the Sanhedrin and how that serves as the basis of our Geulah. It's a shiur that I still find myself talking about with people.
It's a shiur that you have to give again, not on Shabbat, because I've quoted it many times and we need it recorded.
Yes. Well, no, I'm talking about the last Tisha B'Av class that we had.
That was about destruction. Yeah, but you spoke in San Diego. You gave us a shiur about the Geulah, the Sanhedrin, the connection between.
That's true. That's true.
Good.
So this topic is, I think, one that is very, very important because it helps us understand what exactly the practices of Tisha B'Av serve to do when properly observed. The emotions, the themes, the melodies, the kinot, you don't have to be taught how that impacts you, because the impact is intuitive, it's emotional. But when it comes to Avelut, the actions of Avelut are perhaps not as obvious, and therefore the impact that they are supposed to have on a person is also not so obvious. To understand what it serves, what Avelut serves for Am Yisrael as a whole, and for an individual, bifrat, on a personal level, you have to analyze. We're gonna analyze the following sources today from our HaShamayim in understanding the differences between national mourning and personal mourning. there isn't really another example of national mourning besides that of Tisha B'Av. So it's hard to give other examples because they don't exist. But there's a lot of overlap between Tisha B'Av practices and Kippur practices. So we're going to see there's perhaps a connection there. And those connections, as we'll see in a moment, very often do not exist when it comes to personal avilut. All right. So let's begin with the first source. Gemara Ta'anit Daf Lamed. This is a famous Gemara, Tanur Rabbanan. When you have Tanur Rabbanan, you know that the statement being made in front of you is an authoritative statement. Kol mitzvot hanoagot ba'avel noagot b'tisha b'av. All of the restrictions and procedures that an avel, God forbid, a person who lost a relative or a parent has, also apply on Tisha B'Av. Asur b'achila u'shtiya u'v'sicha u'b'nat hazah u'v'tashmish hamita. Off the bat, already, you have a problem with that statement, right? You cannot eat, drink, anoint, wear sandalim, we'll define what that is in a second, or engage in relations. Some of those are true for an avel. But last I checked, avelim do not fast for 7 days. So let's keep that in the back of our minds. You cannot learn Tanakh. Nor may one study the Mishnah, the critical analysis of the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Midrashim, homiletics, uvhalachot, the law, conclusions, uvagadot. Sometimes Mishnah and Halakha are interchangeable, by the way, but since Mishnah is already mentioned here, Halachot are those finalized, restated laws of practice, practical Halakha, like we would say in common lingo, and Agadot. Agadot are not homiletics. People also often get these mixed up. They're not homiletics that elaborate on Pesukim. They are often anecdotes that don't necessarily have a basis in a particular parasha of the Torah or a particular set of Pesukim in the Navi. And the Agadot, you'll often find, more often than not, you'll find them scattered throughout the Gemara as opposed to Midrashim that are their own contained works, right? So you can't learn any of these on Tisha B'Av. You cannot, however, you are allowed to read from the part of the Tanakh that you are not familiar with, and the same applies to the Mishnah. You can learn obscure passages in the Torah Shebe'al Peh. The Koreh bekinot. Kinot here doesn't mean action. I mean, it could also refer to kinot that we say in today's Hebrew, but in the Hebrew of the Mishnah, it meant the book of Echa. Echa were the original kinot, right? And you also have the permission to study Iyov and the gloomy passages, especially towards the end of the book of Yirmiyah, those gloomy passages of the book of Yirmiyah. Okay? And there's no school. Mishum shne'emar, pikudei Adonai yesharim esanach. The Torah makes us glad, and the theme of Tisha B'Av, of course, is not to engage in the ultimate source of Simcha, which is the Torah for us. Okay, the statement of Rabbi Yehuda we'll skip for now. Moving on further in the Gemara, source number 2. There's a debate among Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda regarding the particular practice of Kifiyat HaMitah. What is Kifiyat HaMitah? This was a practice, nobody does this nowadays. This was the practice of Avelim to take the frame of their bed, flip it upside down in order to basically have a person lie closer to the ground when sleeping as opposed to being raised. It's a unique feature of Jewish Avelut, It's also a unique feature of the design of beds up until the Middle Ages or so, a little after the Middle Ages. These types of beds nowadays are not terribly common. And so if one has such a bed, or regarding the practice of Jews who did have those beds in ancient times, there is debate among the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda regarding this practice of personal avelut applying on Tisha B'Av. Tanya, Amru lo, the rabbis told Rabbi Yehuda, what are you going to tell these poor pregnant and nursing women? They gotta sleep in an uncomfortable position. Amar lahem, Rabbi Yehuda says, Af ani lo amarti ela beyapol. This is not an obligatory practice like it is for Avelim. It's something that is only done if doable. Meaning, if doable without Saar, without excessive pain or anguish. The Gemara goes on forward with further discussion, and the Gemara concludes with the words, Chachamim did not agree with Rabbi Yehuda, even if one is able-bodied to do so, to flip one's beds over like this. Now, why is this Gemara relevant for our discussion? Source number 3, Halachot Harif, Rabbeinu Yitzchak Alfasi, who was one of the first to codify the Shakla v'Tarya, the back and forth didactic discussions in the Gemara into final halakha, records the following. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shemuel, Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shemuel, Lo hudu Chachamim. Chachamim didn't agree with Rabbi Yehuda, meaning what? This is a very a critical comment that's made by the Rif. Asauhu kemi shemeto mutal lefanav, de'eno nohek avelut ve'eno chayav b'kriyat hamita. The Chachamim do not apply rules of avelut when it comes to national mourning. So that sounds very counterintuitive. Mourning doesn't apply on National Day of Mourning? Says the Rif, no. The standards of national mourning are not those standards of personal avelut. They are the standards of mi shemeto mutan lefanav. That is, in simple terms, an onen. In onen, we're going to look at the Yad Ramah in a moment to really properly define what an onen is. An onen is not an avel. And people often also forget these two categories. An onen is an individual who lost a relative or a parent whose burial had not yet taken place. This individual is patur mikol mitzvot ha'amurot b'Torah. He is exempt from all the mitzvot. He doesn't have to study Torah. There's obviously restrictions regarding the mitzvot lo ta'aseh, the restrictive mitzvot. He can't eat a sandwich from McDonald's just because he's an onen. It doesn't work that way. So mitzvot aseh, active commandments, he is exempt from. Why is he exempt from them? We're going to see in a second why he's exempt from active commandments. But the Rif applies this category of I don't know if there's an English word for this, of grieving, this category of grief, of aninut, to the status of national mourning, which is Tisha B'Av. So, does that translate over perfectly? We're going to see it translates over into Tisha B'Av practices most of the time, but not all the time. Rabbi Meir Halevi Abulafia, one of the great Chachamim from Spain in the 13th century, he wrote a Perush on the Gemara, very similar to the Rif, actually. It almost mirrors the Halachot HaRif, except unlike the Rif, he also includes the Pesakim and the approaches of his colleagues in Spain over the past 200 some odd years after the life of the Rif. So there's it's the Reef 2.0 basically. It also did not, or let me rephrase that. We do not have the complete set of the Yad Ramah, unlike the Reef. The Reef is, we have in its totality, but unfortunately we do not have the Yad Ramah in its totality. Yad Ramah also elaborates for us sometimes. The Reef rarely elaborates on the definition of words or terms. Yad Ramah will often do that. So over here he says, "V'yesh lefaresh lo hayu mitabelim," regarding the Harugei Bet Din. If somebody was executed by the Sanhedrin, the halakha says, the Mishnah says, you don't mourn this person. Meaning we don't engage in the quintessential examples of mourning that we do for, God forbid, like we would for loved ones. This is something that's, it's apparent, it's, I don't like to use this term because it's difficult for us to, but it's almost like a Kiddush Hashem in a way. The guy is a mass murderer and he gets put to death. That's justice. That's retribution. That's not something that you're going to degrade by bringing public avelut or even private avelut into the discussion, into the sphere. Like the pasuk in Mishlei said, rejoice in the loss of the Reshaim. Ela onenin. But says the Gemara, you do practice aninut for them. The guy could be the worst serial killer on planet Earth, and yet his relatives and parents are still onenin. Umatam anina. Why would you not have avelut, but you would have aninut? She'en anina ela balev. Aninut, unlike the physical conspicuous practices of avelut, aninut is not a practice. It's an emotion. It's a feeling of grief that a person internalizes. This is now the Rama speaking. Since it's not something that's conspicuous or apparent, unlike the guy's death, unlike the practices of avelut, Hitiru lahem, the Chachamim did not object to family members grieving. What are you going to do? You're going to tell a mother not to grieve for her son being killed? It's an emotion. Iname, alternatively, my tam onenim. Why do we have aninut for cases of people we don't mourn? Shein anina ela balev. Aninut is only in the heart. Ve'en adam yachol dichbosh et yitzro shelo yidvea al kerovo. It goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's very hard for a person to control his impulses with regard to the grief of his relative or son or daughter. So, this is a problem that the Yad Ramah indirectly, he doesn't say this directly, because it doesn't have, this discussion has nothing to do with Tisha B'Av. This discussion has to do with Harugei Bet Din, with those who were executed by the court. But from the Ramah's remarks, the Rif stating that we are onenim on Tisha B'Av becomes a little problematic. It becomes a little problematic because, surprise, surprise, in case nobody has noticed, Tisha B'Av has very conspicuous practices. There's symbol after symbol after symbol of grief or mourning, however you want to phrase it. That's not just something that is balev, as the Gemara says. So what to make out of the Rif's comments? It's been a couple of years. I gave this shiur 4 years ago last time. I still don't have an answer. If anyone has an answer, you can, send me an email or call me privately. I would love to know what the Rif is referring. Rabbi Moshe Mitrani, I'm going to go through many of these sources outside for the sake of time. If anyone who's studied with me knows, you know that if we go through all the sources inside, the 1 hour class becomes a 3-hour class. So my apologies. Rabbi Moshe Mitrani, 16th century, contemporary of Maran, Rabbi Yosef Karo, he sat on his Bet Din. Rabbi Halevi has given some very insightful shiurim about him and his relationship with Maran. So he wrote a work called Kiryat Sefer. He also wrote a work, I don't normally do this, but if everyone can see this, for those who read Hebrew. Phenomenal work. Buy it, grab it, get it. Bet Elohim. It's his work on Jewish, on machshava, on Jewish thought and philosophy. The work focuses at great length on the Jewish core beliefs, tefillah, teshuvah. It's a wonderful book to go through. But he wrote a book called Kiryat Sefer, which is a run-on commentary on the Mishneh Torah of Maimonides, of Harambam. Now, he says over here, why is it that an onen is exempt from the mitzvot? He says two possibilities. The Gemara gives the example of Shema, but it applies to other mitzvot as well. He is preoccupied with the burial necessities and logistics and planning. There's a lot going on before a funeral. And if a person has to worry about, did I say the Shema yet? It's Arvit time, I have to pause and pray. Did I or did I not wash my hands in the Netilah before bread? The guy is worrying about burying his lo alenu, his mother, his father, his brother. So because of the tirdat machshavat halev, like the Rabbi Moshe Mitrani says, he's exempt from those mitzvot. Mishum tirda, he says it's similar to a chatan who is getting married. Chatan who's getting married, he's also got a lot, but the flip side of that, right? He's not worrying about grief, he's worrying about the best thing that's happening to him. Still pretty nerve-wracking though, right? So similar to a chatan who's exempt from Shema, he says similar to a chatan who's exempt from the Shema, because unlike an onen, a chatan he's not exempt from other things. It's just the Shema. Now he says, Ubi Yerushalmi mefaresh ta'ama. Talmud Yerushalmi says the reason is totally different. The reason is due to the pasuk L'man tizkor et yom setecha me'eretz Mitzrayim kol yemei chayecha. You have a mitzvah of Zichrat Yetziat Mitzrayim, which is included in the Shema. Kol yemei chayecha. So long as you are, this is not the peshat, but it's a additional layer of understanding. Kol yemei chayecha meaning what? Yamim she'ata osek b'chayim v'lo yamim she'ata osek b'metim. This is only when you're dealing with the living, but so long that's a pun on yemei chayecha, all the days of your living. What are days of your living? Days of your living when you're dealing with the living. But if you're dealing with the dead, then there's no obligation in reciting the Shema. What's the practical difference between these two reasons? Practical difference is, what if a person is still pretty centered, has his head on his shoulders, but is dealing with the burial planning and logistics? According to the first approach that the Rabbi Moshe Mitrani offered, then he would be obligated to say the Shema. He would be obligated in other mitzvot. According to the second reason, it doesn't matter what your state of mind is. There's a no exception. There's a no exception clause to all onanim, regardless of their state of mind. Deal with your dead, then deal with the living. Ramban sums up what we've just analyzed so far in his chidushim, his insights to the Gemara and Ta'anit. He says, what does the Gemara mean when it says all the mitzvot that apply to an Avel also apply to Tisha B'Av? He says, Hahi le'inyan mitzvot lo ta'aseh noagot ba'avel. He says this applies specifically to, we're going to see there's more to this, but this applies only to the restrictive practices of an Avel, of somebody who lost a relative or a parent. Aval kol mitzvot aseh sheba Avel, regarding the active mitzvot, like, remember, flipping of the bed, atifat harosh. That's also a practice few people do nowadays, but it used to be that, and strictly speaking, it's still required that a person wrap one's head during Avelut. So these are not obligatory on Tisha B'Av. And Ramban says that. Also, God forbid, if a person loses a relative, Kehillat. I lament the fact that there are many people nowadays who they don't know that. As a rabbi, I'm involved in funerals from time to time, and you inform people of the obligation to do Kehillat, to tear Kehillat, and not only do some people insist on not doing it, they insist on putting a ribbon instead, and I'll tear the ribbon. It's the famous Americanism, which is unfortunate, but it is what it is. So we don't do Kehillat, even though you would do Kehillat, you would tear Kehillat for a relative. And that's the Ramban quotes that famous Gemara that says Kehillat lechod, avelut lechod. The obligation of mourning and of Kehillat are two separate. They're two separate camps, even though they're contingent upon one another. It's logical, it's reasonable to conclude from the way we categorize Tisha B'Av on the scale of Avelut, and one is obligated to wear tefillin. Ramban goes on to say, even though an Avel does not wear tefillin, since Avelut, Yom Rishon, only the first day is one not allowed to wear tefillin. And by the way, that's when you have the burial occur on the same day as the when you have the burial occur on the same day as the death. So if you have the situation where you're able to tend to the kibura, first day avelut for a person, for an individual, one is exempt from tefillin. One is not allowed to wear tefillin. But the rest of the days of avelut, you are obligated to. Says the Ramban, how could you say that Tisha B'Av has the status of Avelut Yom Rishon? He calls it Avelut Yeshana. This is an old form of Avelut. Not only is it an antiquated Avelut, but it's also Avelut in the form of, it doesn't say this explicitly, but the fact that he categorizes Tisha B'Av in its own category, separate from that of other Avelim. From here, you also learn Ramban makes a distinction between national mourning and personal mourning. The functions are different. Right? The Avelut lo kamir Tisha B'Av tefe meyom sheni da'avel. You can't say that the Tisha B'Av is more severe than the second day of Avelut. And he goes on further to say, what about melacha? And Avel is not allowed to do melacha. Whereas Tisha B'Av, strictly speaking, the halacha does allow a person to go to work. You want to go to work? You want to go work on building other forms of constructive melacha? If the minhag in the city is to do so, then you're allowed to do so. What's the reason for that? Because an Avel is allowed to do melacha b'tzin'ah within his own home privately if he needs to do so. So the rule is not so concrete. It's not so ironclad that it parallels personal avelut. And similarly, we see the same thing with she'elat shalom. An Avel is not allowed to greet people. Yet on Tisha B'Av, like we're going to see in a moment, that practice only applies to what the Harambam calls chaverim, tamidei chachamim. But if somebody doesn't know any better, you don't have to rebuke them. So, Ramban concludes, ונותן תפילין ביד ובראש, שלא ראו לבטל מצווה משום אבלות ישנה. The Chachamim did not see fit to completely parallel the most severe and personal day of avelut of a person in his life to that which is avelut yeshana. Kach niradi. This analysis seems fitting according to what I conclude, and the main point over here, I apologize for skipping it. Asu Tisha B'Av ke'evel le'achar shlosha kan v'kan. They made the status of Tisha B'Av equal to that of a person who loses a parent or a relative, le'achar shlosha yamim, from the third day of Avelut onward, but not like the first day. Rabbeinu Asher, the Rosh, records the practice of his teacher, Rabbeinu Meir Mirotenborg. Others also were of this opinion, but he's the most famous for it, as disagreeing with Ramban. Maharam was of the opinion, De'en yomar yoter mimenu yom kavua b'tiyah ledorot. There's no more bitter of a day than the day that the Mishnah says is Yom Bechiyah Shel Dorot, a perpetual day of mourning for the Jewish people, for all of the tragedies, right? The famous 5 tragedies that occurred throughout the generations. And so because you cannot, in his opinion, equate anything more severe to the tragedies that occurred during these days, says Rabbeinu Meir, Nireh de Tisha B'Av en lahaniach tefillin. You shouldn't wear the tefillin, period. And the Rosh politely takes issue with this position of his teacher, and he says he probably held this way to try to find justification for Minhag Ashkenaz. The practice in the Franco-German lands, at least throughout the period of the Middle Ages, seems to be that they didn't wear tefillin at all on Tisha B'Av. We're going to see from the Rokeach in a moment, it wasn't just that. It was also many other things that Ashkenazim just didn't do at all, period. From Ramban, however, I should point out, there was no distinction made between the timing of the tefillin worn on Tisha B'Av. So it seems from Ramban, there would be no difference if a person wished to wear the tefillin in the morning, in the afternoon. For Ramban, it would be perfectly acceptable to wear talit and tefillin like you would any morning, even though it's Tisha B'Av. Now, I have sources 8, 9, and 10. All of these are sources from Maran HaBet Yosef. Rabbi Yosef Karo writes in the Bet Yosef in 3 separate instances regarding days where we do not say Tachanun. Now, this is very interesting. Normally, we don't say the Minhag. It is a Minhag, by the way. Harambam quotes that in the name of the Geonim, that during Shabbatot, Yamim Tovim, Beritot, etc., person, an individual or a community does not recite the Tachanunim. In modern terms, that means for Sephardim, the Vidui, the David, we go straight to Yehishem, as we all know. Now, what about instances where it is not a Moed? You have 2 examples of this. Tisha B'Av and Bar Minan, God forbid, the case of a mourner. Maran writes that Beveit ha'avel en nofilim. There is no nefilat apayim or tachanun because of that pasuk in Amos, ve'havachti chagechem le'avel. Hilkach en omrim viduim tachanunim beveit ha'avel. Le'evel, excuse me, right? This is a blessing that the Navi Amos gives to the Jewish people. I apologize. It is a nevuah that the Navi Amos gives the Melech Israel, that God will turn the Chagim into days of mourning. That sounds horrible. Hilkach en omrim viduim. Therefore, no vidu is said. Why? Because, says Maran in the next, or excuse me, I didn't quote this. I should have quoted it. I apologize. Maran mentions further, based on Shibulei Haleket, one of the works, 15th century works of halakha from Italy. Because the chag over here is juxtaposed to avelut, there's a connection between the two, and in the house of an avel, therefore, we do not say tachanunim. There's some sort of a connection between the two. What that connection is not quite clear. Shibulei Haleket doesn't specify. And furthermore, we're going to see that's actually not the only reason why an avel does not recite tachanunim. I should point out, by the way, that Maran is specific about his language. Bevet ha'avel, in the home of an avel. Meaning what? Meaning, potentially, there are some achronim who say like this: if an avel is visiting some other house and he wants to organize a minyan there, that they would say tachanunim there. There's some debate about that, though, so I'm not going to go too far off into tangents. Maran also says the same thing about the mincha and day of Tisha B'Av. They are referred to as moed, right? This is the famous nechama that the prophet, the Navi Zechariah, gives us. Tzom HaChamishi, Tzom HaAsiri, all of these days of fasting and mourning that the Jewish people have will be turned into days of joy and Moadim Tovim. So, because Tisha B'Av ultimately has a silver lining, there's nechama at the end, we treat it as a moed that doesn't require tachanunim. Now, Maran also quotes the Rokeach. We're going to read the Rokeach inside. Rabbi Elazar of Worms. One of the earliest works of halakha in a complete set, 12th century. He was a contemporary of Harambam. He quotes the Rokeach as saying what we just said, but also, in addition to that, he says the Rokeach offers another reason why we don't say tachanunim or selichot. You'll notice this morning there was no tachanun, there was no selichot, right? Why was there no tachanun or selichot? Because we read in Echa, sakota ve'ananach me'avor tefillah. Yirmiyah Navi says you created like a shielding cloud, any ability for tefillah to pass through. So what are tachanunim? Tachanunim are supplications in English, right? They are additions to the tefillah that we're required to say. So why bother with more than the chiyuv? I'll say my Amidah, the Shema, Pesukei de Zimra. These are things we have as part of our duties, as part of our requirements as Jews. But the tachanunim, that's reshut. There's no chiyuv to say it. To add to the tefillot, Yirmiyah Hanavi tells us in Echa, this is not a day for added supplication. It's kind of similar to the parasha that we're going to read this week, God willing. And Borei Olam tells Moshe Rabbeinu, Vayomer Adonai Elai Rav Lach. It's enough. Right, in Farsi, if you irritate your parents, you know what they tell you? Basse. Enough. I don't want to hear this. I'm done. So, one problem, I say this with the utmost humility and humbleness before Maran, but the first reason that he quotes is not mentioned in the Rokeach. He quotes it in the name of the Rokeach, but at least in the version of the Rokeach we have, it's not mentioned. The Rokeach only mentions the reason that it's a day of supplications not being wanted. That also changes the dynamic of personal mourning and national mourning. For Maran, and the sources that he quotes, there's a common thread between the two. They are days of Moed. Again, what the day of Moed is for a personal mourner, not entirely clear. It could be because it'll be a day of Techiyat HaMetim one day, God willing. Not entirely clear. Tisha B'Av, we know why. The Navi Zechariah tells us it's going to be turned into a day of Yom Tov one day. For the Rokeach, the themes are total opposites, complete opposites. When it comes to a personal mourner, there's no mention of not saying Tachanunim. When it comes to national mourning, the opposite. It's a day of mourning specifically, it's a day of no Tachanunim, specifically because your tefillot are undesirable, unlike the implication that it's a moed and that they would be desirable. You see in source 11, the Rokeach, I'm also going to do this outside. He quotes Minhag Avotai. You know, this is a very old Ashkenazi practice when the Rokeach says that. When they go to the synagogue on Tisha B'Av, they remove their shoes. So there were no Crocs then, there were no Nike sneakers. They walked barefoot. Okay? The Yoshvin al Gabe Karka. By the way, you know what? I'm jumping the gun. Keep this in your back pocket, though. They sat on the ground. I did not mention anything about sitting on the ground so far. For Avelim or Tisha B'Av. Okay? So Rokeach mentions we sit on the ground. Is that a chiyuv? No, it's not a chiyuv. Rokeach says minhag avotai. Ve'en omer vihi noam. We don't say vihi noam. We don't say vani zot pirtiotam in the Ovazion. Now shachrit Tisha B'Av, we don't do we don't have the tachanun for the reason I just said. But mincha is regular. You say anenu, nachem, etc., etc. And this is very interesting. Rokeach says, en mit'atefin. We don't wear talet at all. So forget not wearing it in the morning. You don't wear talet at all. Al shem bitza emrato. Bitza Adonai emrato. God has decreed that which he decreed. There's no changing his mind. What does that have to do with the talet? The talet was usually worn as a sign of appeal or pleading before Borei Olam. It's like that famous Gemara in Brachot where God appeared to Moshe Rabbeinu like a shaliach tzibur lifnei teva with a talet on. Right? So for that reason, there's no talet worn. Below tefillin. Rokeach also quotes the practice of not wearing tefillin, period. Why? Lasum lav le'tzion atet lahem pe'er tachat efer. This is a placement, a sign for the mourners of Yerushalayim to put in place of their, in place of their pe'er, their crown. That's what the Navi Yecheskel refers to as tefillin. It's the crown of the Jewish people. You have ashes instead. Now, what's very interesting is the Rokeach says notnin efer makle beroshehen. There we take tree ash and place it on our heads during Tisha B'Av. I don't know if there are any communities that still do this, but that's based on a Gemara in Baba Batra that I'll go to in a second that quotes this verse in Yeshaya. So it's a day of ashes. You can't wear tefillin where there are ashes. Again, pretty strong minhag considering the Gemara is silent on this. The Gemara never equates Tisha B'Av, national mourning, to, God forbid, a person losing a relative on the first day. Okay. Gemara in Baba Batra, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. What is the meaning of the verse? Im lo a'alet Yerushalayim al rosh simchati. We say that at every wedding. That's in reference to the ash that the Chatanim put on their heads. Amar le Rav Papa le Abaye. Rav Papa, as a follow-up to the point that that's being quoted by Abaye here in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak. Heicha manechle, where are the ashes placed? Bimkom tefillin, they're placed where the tefillin is placed. So the Chatanim will have this custom. You're not going to put it, over here. You're not going to put the ashes by your ears. You're going to put it by the place where you wear the tefillin shel rosh. Shene'emar lasum lev letzion latel ein pe'er tachat efen. That's the verse we just quoted from Yeshaya. But the Rokeach does something very interesting with this Gemara. Again, big lesson. Whenever you're studying Torah, if a source is being quoted, don't take it for granted. Rokeach quotes this Gemara as a source for us not wearing Tisha B'Av, tefillin on Tisha B'Av because we're wearing the ashes. You'll notice the Gemara has no discussion of Tisha B'Av over here. It's talking about Chatanim. Yeah? So the Rokeach obviously has a different twist on this. His take is, Heicha manachle, where do you place the ashes? Bimkom tefillin. Not where the tefillin is. You wear the ashes instead of the tefillin. In other words, just like a chatan wouldn't wear tefillin walking down the aisle or under the puppah, you would have the ashes. So too, if you're wearing tefillin, period, you have the ashes. Obviously, you're not going to wear ashes in place of tefillin every day. So what day is this referring to? It's referring to Tisha B'Av, the Rokeach says. Pretty wild theory, right? I quote from the Levush, Rav Mordechai Yafeh of Eastern Europe. He wrote one of the most monumental follow-ups to the Shulchan Aruch for Ashkenazim. It's a very underappreciated work. In the Levush, he writes, the reason why Avel does not say Tachanun, or excuse me, why we don't say Tachanunim in the house of an Avel, is because of the same reason why we don't say Tachanunim at night. It's not a time for supplication. It's a stage of din, he says. And he says in Avel, God forbid, also is facing Yemei Din. This is not a time where good decrees are befalling him, right? Obviously, he wouldn't have lost a loved one. He wouldn't be in Avelud in the first place if he didn't have a Gezar Din decreed against him. So, similar to the Rokeach, the Levush says that's why Aveli in Beveta Avel, in the house in Avel, you don't have these added supplications, selichot, etc., etc. That's an important reason because also it's an alternative to what Maran was saying. Maran Rabbi Yosef Karo was of the opinion that it's compared to a moed. Here, the Rokeach, the Levush, they're saying the opposite. They're saying it's a super not moed. It's an anti-moed. Unlike Tisha B'Av, nobody disagrees that Tisha B'Av is moed, right? So for the Levush, you have almost a hybrid. Avelim don't say it because they have din against them. Whereas for Tisha B'Av, that's different. That's a day of Moed. We don't mourn there. And the Rokeach takes a complete extreme approach. He's not a hybrid approach. He's a total extreme approach. Both days, actually, I'm not sure what the Rokeach says about mourners. But from what I recall, mourners and Tisha B'Av are days of Din, are days of Gezerah, where tefillot are not heard. We're going to skip a little bit. I quote the Ra'avad. The Ra'avad was also of the opinion that you don't wear tefillin at all on Tisha B'Av. He does something very strange, though. He says, Ki ani me'olam lo hinachtim bo. He brags about the fact that he never wore tefillin on Tisha B'Av. Why does he brag about it? I don't know. But I thought it's interesting that he does that. It's better to wear ashes. So that's the Ra'avad. Rabbi Abraham ben David of southern France. Maran also, in source 15, quotes the practice of not saying Kaddish Titkabal. That's the common Sephardi practice, because how could you say, God accept our tefillot? So, he says that He says, "Aval b'shachrit omrim oto." We do say it in the morning. The fishikvar shilku v'simu lomar kinot v'romim ksapsu kenechamot besofo. We do say titkabal in the morning. Some Sephardim do, some don't. But Maran's opinion was that you do, because at that point already, probably in reference to Chatzot, it makes more sense that he's talking about saying this after midday, is to say Kaddish Titkabal, God accept our prayers. That's what the Kaddish Titkabal is about, because at that point we're in the stage of Nechama. We're in a stage of consolation. The cloud that Echa talks about is being lifted. Teshuvot Rabbi Akiva Eger. Rabbi Akiva Eger, 18th century, tremendous Talmid Chacham. He was known in particular for his vehement wars against the Haskalah, the Enlightenment, and the Reform. He in his Teshuvot, he takes great issue with the fact that people conflate Avelut and Tisha B'Av with one another. He says, how can you say that you skipped Kaddish Titkabal? V'chi tfilat 18 shel ha'avel lo yitkabel. I'm an avel. Or let's say I'm a simple Jew who's observing Tisha B'Av. You're going to tell me just because it's Tisha B'Av, just because it's I'm an avel, that my Amidah is not accepted? Then why do I have a chiyuv to say the Amidah? It's a very simple question, but it's also a very powerful question. If you're telling me don't say the Kaddish Titkabal, don't say you can extend this to Tachanunim as well, by the way. Why give me a chiyuv? Why give me an obligation to say the Amidah, to pray the Amidah? The halacha should say, Avelim, don't say Amidah. And Rabbi Akiva Eger says, I looked into it. There's sources that concur with me. And he says, you can't compare. It's true, really, that Avelut and Tisha B'Av are two different things. The Eno Domer Tisha B'Av. Personal Avelut is not similar to that of Tisha B'Av. He says, with regard to Tisha B'Av, you don't say, the practice is to not say Kaddish Titkabal. Makes sense. I mean, Rabbi Akiva Eger isn't endorsing it, but he's saying there's basis for it. Why? Because it could also be reflective of the kinot. The kinot are horrible, terrible things. We don't want those to be accepted. So even though we know the Kaddish Titkabal is in reference to the Amidah, it's not in reference to the kinot, but we don't want to give any wrong ideas. And he says, it appears kefi kol haposkim dinhagu lomar balayla titkabal achat tfilat 18. All of the classical sources in the poskim do say to say Kaddish Titkabal after the services, even though there's a minhag not to. Rabbi Akiva Eger won't go so far as to say don't say the Kaddish Titkabal, or he won't go as far, he won't go as far as to say that you have to say the Kaddish Titkabal and Tisha B'Av. However, mikol makom ein ledamot avel hazeh. You cannot say an avel is akin to this case. We're not saying kinot in the house of an avel. It's just like any other house of tefillah. If an avel comes to the synagogue, we're not going to say kinot for him. According to most poskim, if there's a day where there's chiyuv to sing Hallel, even Rosh Chodesh, just because you're in the house of an Avel doesn't trump pre-existing obligations. So Rabbi Akiva Eger concludes, based on this, Yishtaka davar, let this comparison be forgotten. It's a mistaken ruling that people equate the two. They're two very different things. I know I'm pressed on time over here and I want to get to questions, so I'm going to jump even more. Harambam, I said I would get back to this. Harambam, in passing, quotes the practice of Avelim sitting on the ground. And he doesn't provide the commentators on Harambam don't provide a source. You want to know why they don't provide a source? Because they didn't have the source. in our versions of the Gemara, Bavli and Yerushalmi, there is no recorded obligation for an Avel to sit on the ground or on chairs that are very low. It doesn't exist. The first to record this, actually, is Ramban. Ramban, in his version of the Gemara and Masechet Moed Katan, records the practice of Avelim sitting on the ground. Based on what? Based on Pasuk in Iyov. The Pasuk says, the Gemara says, Minayin le'avel she'ino rashai leshev al gabei amita, el al gabei karka, she'emar va'yeshivu ito la'aretz. The friends of Iyov sat with him on the ground. He had just lost everything. From here we learn you sit on the ground. Very interesting. So Harambam had this version of the Gemara that the Ramban Nachmanides also had. We do not have it though. So notice though, Ramban does not quote this practice with regard to Tisha B'Av. And the Rokeach only mentioned it with regard to Minhag Avotai. So here you see another difference. Another difference between national mourning and personal mourning. National mourning doesn't have the theme of sitting on the ground, whereas personal mourners do. I'll end off with one last source. There's so much I wanted to cover, but such is the nature of Torah learning. It takes time. The last source I wanted to go through, source 35. Anybody who does not mourn, this is in reference to private, personal avelut. This is considered a savage behavior. A person in a state of avelut should be in a state of the mental state of what? Of worry, trepidation, and introspection of his actions. He should do teshuvah during this period. This is for those who are interested, it's something that I'm going to be covering in the next shiur that will, God willing, have at 7 p.m. Eastern time, pertaining to the focus of avelut being on the deceased or on the person, or excuse me, on the deceased or on the mourners. Harambam takes the approach that avelut is not about the deceased. That's God's business. That's already in the realm of Bet Din Shel Ma'ala. You are not a member of Bet Din Shel Ma'ala. Says Harambam, the avelut is for you. It's to refine you. It's to change you as a family member. Ve'echad b'nei chabura shemet hida kol hachabura kula. Gemara on Shabbat, famous Gemara on Shabbat, says that if there's a group of dear colleagues and someone dies from within the group, the entire group should be in a state of da'aga. Says Harambam quotes the Gemara further. The entire first 3 days, you should view yourself as having a sword by your shoulders, on your neck. That's remember Ramban, we quoted Nachmanides who said Tisha B'Av is like the third day of mourning till the end. So that makes a lot of sense. Maimonides, Rambam doesn't say it explicitly, but it's implicit. You're put in timeout. You're in the corner, right? That's exactly the theme the common thread we see throughout many of the practices on Tisha B'Av. There's no she'elat shalom. There are no activities of simcha, etc., etc. From the third day onward, you can go about, and if you need to work, you can work. Harambam is summing something up over here. This is a quote from the 13th chapter of Hilchot Avelut. This is the end of Hilchot Avelut. Kol zeh, all of these practices of Avelut, kedei lehachin atzmo nachzor, ve'or mishinato. It's to prepare yourself to do teshuvah, to wake up from your autopilot, to wake up from your slumber. V'arehu omer. Is it not the prophet Yirmiyah who says, Hikita otam velo chalu? the Galut happened. We were being taken into Bavel. They didn't get the wake-up call. Bnei Israel did not get the wake-up call, and that's why the Galut continued. What's the implication, though? The implication is that you need to wake up when tragedy befalls. You need to introspect when tragedy befalls. It's an opportunity for you to grow, for you to do teshuvah, for you to spot your weaknesses, your blind spots. Maran, in his commentary to the Mishneh Torah and Kesef Mishneh, I only quoted sources 32, 34, and 36 for Rabbi Halevi. We had a talk, personal, I think it was a phone call or maybe a back and forth messages. I noticed Harambam has I noticed that Maran, from time to time, will say Divrei Rabbeinu Re'uyim Elav. The words of Maimonides, it's fitting for him. He does this when Harambam gets emotional. There are certain times in Mishneh Torah where Harambam, particularly if he mentions achzariut, savagery, and you'll notice those citations and quotes are here if you want to look at them. It's very telling of the way Maran, Rabbi Yosef Karo, viewed Maimonides. He viewed him not only as a law textbook, he viewed him as a man with deep convictions, deep emotion, and the very nature of halakha is that it's something that has to be internalized into the very fiber of our beings. With that, I will conclude. There's obviously way more that we could have discussed, but I want to leave time for questions.
תודה רבה.
Thank you, Rachel. Anyone have any questions? A lot of material. Bionatan?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, my dear friend and Rabbi. Hope to see you in San Diego one of these days soon.
Thank you, Zev. Hope to be there soon.
Ezrat
Or
Hashem.
better yet, Yerushalayim.
Ezrat Hashem.
Amen.
I have a slight question to follow up.
Sorry, who was that speaking? What was that?
Schofield.
Oh, Binyamin, yes. Please, go ahead.
So, based on what we're learning right now, the custom to sit on the floor on Tisha B'Av, this is an Ashkenazi custom?
It is. It's an Ashkenazi custom that Maran endorses, though. It's brought down in Shulchan Aruch. But it's interesting because Rabbi Gabai here at Mikveh Israel and I were having a discussion about this last night. There's some unclarity regarding the Spanish-Portuguese custom. In Amsterdam, in London, they do not sit on the ground. They sit on the benches. But the joke is the benches are so uncomfortable, it's better to sit on the ground. That's why they sit on the benches. So what would be the basis for that, though? The basis would probably be that it's not something that is required mi'ikar hadin. It's something that was adopted later on, as early as the days of the Rokeach, right? It's a very old minhag, but it's not one that is explicit in the Talmud.
Gotcha. It's interesting. It's interesting to see the different perspectives regarding, the why of the velut of Tisha B'Av and the back and forth of. It's interesting to see in general the more morbid outlook of the Chachmei Ashkenaz in general as compared to Chachmei. I know Baby has mentioned in Shiur that many of the mourning customs, the 9 days and 3 weeks, evolved from the Hasidei Ashkenaz from back in the day.
Exactly. That would be
like the mourning of the Beit HaMikdash, in particular, and it's just interesting to see that, that perspective, and if you chase that perspective down, you end up with much more intense mourning practices than you do if you have a less morbid outlook on the whole mourning process in the first place.
So Very, very good observation you mentioned, and I think you're hitting the nail on the head. The Maharami Rothenberg, for example, mentioned that how can you have a more bitter day than the day of perpetual tragedy?
Right.
The issue that Chachmei Sefarad take with this, particularly Ramban, is that it's Avelut Yeshana. And my chidush, this is my insight. I'm not speaking in the name of Ramban. It's also a different category of mourning. It's national mourning. It's not a period of personal introspection and teshuvah that the Gemara says is a time of, right? That's what the Rambam quoted. The Rambam that we quoted said is a day of, is a period, a week of waking up from one's slumber for all of one's life. You're doing a full review and audit of your entire being during the period of Avelut. Tisha B'Av, I'm not trying to downplay it. It's a very serious day, but it's not woe unto me, the worst day in human history. It's a day for Nachmanides, for Ramban. It's a day of Avelut Yeshana. We remember our past, and we set aside the time to be able to, Be'ezrat Hashem, do the teshuvah that's needed for us to do national teshuvah together. The work takes a lot longer, but it's also not as complicated, right? There weren't too many things wrong that the Jewish people have done to merit galut. I mean, they give a list. I mean, there is a list, but it's not infinitely long. The fact that we still cannot, like the Gemara in Yerushalmi Yomah says, that in every generation where the Beit HaMikdash is not built, it is as if we have destroyed it. What's the meaning of the Gemara? The Yerushalmi is saying, I'm giving you a finite list of things you need to fix. If you can't get your act together and fix those things, then how have you fixed the problem? The problem still remains. Right? Whereas the Hasidei Ashkenaz take the approach that no, the tragedies, the emotion, that's what makes it so horrible and terrible, even more so than personal loss.
Right. It's interesting because of Yonatan Levi in this year that he gave recently here in New York a couple of weeks ago. He was talking about Har Bayit, and he was talking about how, like, it's interesting how you see how, and like many Batei Knesset, the focus on the day is they focus on reading, sad poems about all different tragedies that happened, a lot of Holocaust videos, and very little actually about the actual Har Bayit, and the fact that the only reason why we're not on Har Bayit right now is due to it's our own fault that we're not there. Like, we have the capacity to do so, and yet we're still, as a nation, are not doing it.
Mechilai, Rabbi Yosef, 1 second. Is this a Q&A part already?
Yes.
Is it okay with you if I end the recording officially?
Yes.
That way people can ask whatever they want to ask.
Okay.